Good evening, everybody. Good evening. What a crowd. Thank y'all so much for coming out on a Tuesday night. You could have done anything tonight, and you decided to come support the literary arts and humanities here at UNC Asheville. So thank you so much for making that decision. And I want to thank Catherine, Frank, and Ollie for always being such great partners for these events and letting us use this room. It only cost us $10,000 a night. We'll be passing around an offering plate like they did in the Baptist church when I was growing up to raise the funds to make it up. But they're just such wonderful partners. And I also want to thank my colleague Kenya Liplet from Advancement for running the live stream and getting this room set up with the students. She's just like probably the most reliable person in my life. So we all need a Kenya in our lives. My name's Wiley Cash. I am the curator of the Common Word Community Read. Our text for this semester is 13 Moons by Charles Frazier. I imagine that most of you were introduced to Charles's work via Cold Mountain, either the novel or the film, both of which are actually very wonderful. But I met Charles's work through 13 Moons, and so that novel's always had a soft spot. I've always had a soft spot in my heart for that book, and so I chose it for a number of reasons. But one of the big reasons was the tie-in to Cherokee history and culture, and so I'm really excited about that tie-in. I'm also really excited that a writer that I very much admire, Terry Roberts, is going to be here with us tonight to talk about literary portrayals of Madison County. If you've read 13 Moons, it continually circles back to the Warm Springs Inn, and when I saw that, I was like, I bet Terry's going to have some stuff to say about this. And so when I asked him, I was very gracious. He was very gracious and kind to do it. Our next event is actually next week, our next event of the series. We are taking a day trip to Cherokee, North Carolina. During this event on Wednesday, October 2nd, we'll gather at Kitchener, the original town of the Cherokee. We'll go behind the scenes with special exhibits at the Museum of the Cherokee People, and we'll enjoy a native meal for lunch that might surprise you. Maybe we'll even do a little gambling at the casino. I don't know. It depends on the crowd that we're with. But unfortunately, if you're in the audience and you're like, that sounds amazing, this event is sold out. So it's going to be amazing. We're going to all talk about it when we see you. Our event after that is going to close our series. It's Monday, October 28th, right here at 7 p.m. It's going to be an in-conversation event with Charles Frazier and Annette Simuk Clapsaddle, who's an enrolled member of the Eastern Band and author of the novel Even As We Breathe. They will be in conversation talking about the experience of Charles researching Cherokee history, a journey that led him to Annette, and they have been buddies ever since. But tonight's event, Hot Springs and the Novels Set There, is a lecture given by Terry Roberts, and I want to tell you a little bit about Terry. He is the author of 6 novels, A Short Time to Stay Here, which won the William Morris Prize for Southern Fiction, and the Sir Walter Wiley Award for Fiction. Those are 2 really wonderful prizes. The William Morris Prize is a national award given to Southern literature that bridges some kind of cultural, social, historical gap. And the Sir Walter Wiley Prize is a prize exclusive to North Carolina writers. He's also the author of That Bright Land, The Holy Ghost Speak Easy, a revival. My Mistress's Eyes Are Waving Black. I'm skipping the title. I'm skipping over all the words to get to the titles. And The Sky Club. And he has a novel coming out just a couple of days called The Devil Hath a Pleasing Shape. It'll be released October 1st. So you can get it at Malaprops here in town. Roberts is a lifelong teacher and educational reformer, as well as an award-winning novelist. He is a native of the mountains of western North Carolina, born and bred. His ancestors include 6 generations of mountain farmers, as well as the bootleggers and preachers who appear in his novels. He was raised close by his grandmother, who was born in 1888, and passed, some of y'all in this room are like, that's not so old, and passed to him the magic of the past, along with the grit and humor of mountain storytelling. Terry is the director of the National Padilla Center and lives in Asheville, North Carolina with his wife, Lynn. I am so thrilled and honored to introduce Terry Roberts. Take it away.
I'm not going to say anything after that. It can only go downhill, right, from here. That's my wife Lynn in blue back there. She's sitting next to Wiley. She married into this, yeah. Those of you who know us know she's the brains of the operation. She made this PowerPoint, and not only that, she put an arrow on the first slide so that I wouldn't lose Hot Springs. That's why that's up there. I think, if I'm not mistaken, Wiley's first novel and my first novel came out the same year, both set in Madison County, and neither were titled The Bridges of Madison County. Exactly. Clint Eastwood would have been in the movie, right? If that, yeah. But so, and so I always feel a kinship, right? And so when Wiley emailed me and said, "Would you do this?" I didn't even look at the calendar. I didn't even ask permission. I just said yes, because how much of a good thing is it to be here, but also to get a chance to do something with Wiley? That's about as good as it gets. So, a little bit about Hot Springs. What I thought we would do, how many of you have read every single word of 13 Moons? Dang, really? Okay. Well, we'll talk about it, and we'll talk about the 2 chapters in the second part of the book that are set very much in Hot Springs. We'll also talk about a couple of other books that are set predominantly there, and a little bit about the history of the place. So we know you read the book. How many of you have soaked in the hot tubs? We'll talk about that. Yeah, everything from gout to syphilis is what I'm told. So we'll do a little survey and find out exactly what it was you were up to in the hot tubs. And again, it's a pleasure also to get to talk about, for me, to get to talk about 13 Moons. Like Wiley, I think it's a wonderful novel. It's a tour de force in a lot of ways about Western North Carolina. So to introduce things, what I thought I might say is there are spots on the map, and that's why we thought we might begin with a map, in Western North Carolina that are, and I don't even really know exactly what to call them, they're like literary focal points. And I don't know if it's fault lines under the ground, I don't know if it's crystals, I don't know exactly what it is, but there are places that are hot spots when it comes to literature. Lexington Avenue is one, by the way. There are 4 novels that are set either almost exclusively or predominantly on little old Lexington Avenue. And your homework by next week is to write them all. No, I'm teasing. Hot Springs is one of those places. Hot Springs, because of its history, has attracted all kinds of interest over the years. A few details, of course, the Native Americans, even before the Cherokee, indigenous peoples, and then the Cherokee knew about the springs before European settlers did. There is a place on the Tennessee line about 5 miles downstream on the French Broad River from Hot Springs called Paint Rock, which is also a landmark in Cherokee life. The reason I wanted to underscore that, of course, is that you're reading a novel that is very much about Native American experience, specifically the Cherokee experience. And so there's a lot of connections in the landscape between the Qualla boundary and Hot Springs, among other places. Traders from the colonies, the European colonies, came to Hot Springs sometime in the 1770s. And yes, that's the time of the Civil War, okay? On March 19th, 1791, a man named William Nelson bought the property with the intention of building an inn because Europeans who were sick, were ill, were suffering from some kind of chronic ailment were already traveling by foot, by wagon, by horseback, when there were almost no roads to speak of, to get to Hot Springs to soak in the mineral baths there, the warm mineral baths. And so there's something about the place that goes back in time to the time of the Revolutionary War. I will say, just in passing, my own ancestors were in Madison County by 1800. Running from what, I don't know, but we can speculate, right? But And so they were farming there all those years since, and Hot Springs has been, at various points in its history, a very, very important place. And I want to say just a word or two before we dive deeply about its role in 13 Moons. There are 2 chapters in part 4 of the novel. The 4th part is called The Nightlands, and by now you know, of course, that's a reference to death and to life after death and to what might await us and to the approach, if you will, to that. It struck me when I first read the novel, by the way, that these 2 chapters, out of all the chapters in the book, could almost stand alone as a short story. I don't know, again, if you go back and you read them, there are 27 pages in the first edition that's pictured on this slide in this book. Claire Featherstone, it makes an important appearance there in the second half of the novel. And of course, Will Campbell is there, and they come together, and there's a period in which maybe, just maybe, they might have a future. What turns out, and again, spoiler alert, is that perhaps not by the end of those 2 chapters. And I don't know, how many of you are romantics? Come on. I think the oldest people in the room are the romantics, right? The young ones are like, no, not me. Well, I'm a romantic, particularly as a reader. And so when I got to that section of the book, the first time I read it, and I read it probably 3 times, I was cheering for them, right? Do you ever do that for characters? Come on, you can do it, right? Well, maybe not. But anyway, there are echoes of the past in those chapters as well as of the present, and the present is sometime, of course, after the Civil War. And what I thought I might do is just read you a little bit, just very quickly, from the very beginning of that chapter, because it's a description of the Warm Springs Hotel, and the man can write. Can we get an amen on that? The man can write, okay? He can just flat out go. The Warm Springs Hotel was a wondrous refuge down in its remote river gorge, 4 days from the nearest railhead. That's a clue to when this is happening, by the way. A summer resort, mostly. For the better part of 2 decades, before and after the war, I was frequently a resident in all quarters of the year, including the depths of winter, when the hotel was nearly empty and cold drafts blew through the dark ballroom and the lawn was blanketed in snow, marred by a narrow path down which only the bravest guests ventured to immerse themselves in the steaming water of the pools. Even in the lowest of low seasons, there was money to be made at late-night card games and unattached women to court. Ladies, you can't see the men in the audience. They're all smiling at them. Wealthy young widows and their spinster cousin travel companions, the sad and needy wives of wealthy old men who napped through the afternoon by the broad lobby fireplace with their hands crossed over their uprisen bellies, and then, after a big pork dinner, retired immediately to bed. And of course, the lovely governesses, smart and brittle and filled with resentment. And it goes on from there. That's the first paragraph or so. I think in a way to read these 2 chapters is to read them as a beautiful interlude in a beautiful book. They're framed by, of course, his interaction, Will's interaction with the razor man who cuts him and with the gypsy lady, but at the core of these 2 chapters is this reunion with Claire Featherstone. So where did this happen? Where did this take place? And that's our topic for this evening. Important for us to know is that the Buncombe Turnpike, have you heard of the Buncombe Turnpike, right? You know about that. Was built along the French Broad River through Hot Springs. It was called Warm Springs at the time in 1828, not that long after the turn of the century, obviously, and also well before the Civil War, connecting Tennessee and Kentucky to the East Coast, and it was in many ways the superhighway of the South at the time. Farmers drove thousands of horses, cattle, hogs, and wait for it, turkeys. and other livestock to markets in Charleston and Augusta on the turnpike, and they stopped in Hot Springs to take the waters along the way. So if you've heard of the Buncombe Turnpike, it was extraordinarily important, well before the railroad, and it's part of the reason why Hot Springs was Hot Springs. The other reason, of course, is the mineral baths themselves. A man who's important in the history of Hot Springs is named James Patton. You know our Patton Avenue and his family, and the Patton House on Charlotte Street. That's all the same family. He bought the springs in 1831, and by 1837, again, think about the timing, right after the Buncombe Turnpike was completed, Patton was no fool, he built a 350-room Warm Springs Hotel with 13 tall columns on the front of the building commemorating, anybody want to guess? The 13 colonies. Because of its size and grandeur, it was called Patton's White House. The dining room could seat 600 people. This is in little tiny Hot Springs. And I'll tell you that in a few places, like all writers who write historical fiction, I hang my head in shame, we don't always get the historical facts exactly right. Charles writes, of course, in this chapter about, I can't remember how many columns he put on the front of the hotel, but it was a heck of a lot more than 13, okay? So, but that's okay, right? I want to show you a couple of pictures from that era. These pictures were made by a photographer named Rufus Morgan, who was from the coast originally and who traveled extensively in western North Carolina. And that is a picture of the front of Patton's White House taken from the bridge over the French Broad River. Originally, the bridge is not where it is now. That bridge, which is constructed out of wood, as you can see, went across the river right in front of the hotel, which is roughly where the spa is now, okay? So what you're seeing is the hotel as it's described largely in 13 Moons. Rufus Morgan took these photographs sometime between 1869 and 1880. So again, same time period, right after the Civil War, the period that Charles is writing about in 13 Moons when Will Campbell goes to visit there. And if you have got your glasses, you can see Will Campbell on the bridge in front of the hotel. Some of you are nodding and some of you are laughing. That's a joke. But it could be, right? It could be. Historical fictional characters are real, right? Absolutely. And sometimes they show up in paragraphs. Or not in paragraphs. Well, they always show up in paragraphs. Sometimes they show up in photographs. That's what I was trying to say. Next photograph, also by Morgan, same time period, is Visit to Hot Springs. This is the veranda of the hotel seen from one end. There are those columns. The bearded gentleman standing up on the left-hand side. Anybody want to take a guess? You should know who this is, historians. It's Braxton Bragg, famous Confederate general, taking the waters after the war. And good old Braxton makes a cameo appearance in That Bright Land, and I'll mention that in a minute. There is some speculation that the gent up close to the front on the right-hand side with a little girl standing with her arm on his leg might be Zeb Vance. But that's an awfully young and awfully good-looking Zeb Vance for this time period. He'd been governor during the war by the time this photograph was taken. I'm not buying it. But you will hear people tell you that that's also Zeb Vance. I don't think so. It's possible. It's possible. The interesting thing about this photograph, again, if you have an imagination, you can pick out who you think might be Will Campbell back there, the hero of 13 Moons back there in the crowd. You can also maybe pick out my guy, who is named Jake Ballard in That Bright Land. That's also roughly when that novel is set. I don't think Jake and Will met each other, but it'd be a great short story, wouldn't it? Okay. A couple of other interesting factors about Hot Springs in this particular time period is that there was some interest by speculators from the north. Are any of you speculators from the north? There's one honest woman right over there. Some of the rest of you are lying, I don't know. But anyway, yeah, speculators from New York. This newspaper called The Colonist was published by a group called the Western North Carolina Manufacturing and Agricultural Association in Manhattan. Okay. They cooked up this plan to buy up a big chunk of property in western North Carolina. Hot Springs was their primary target, then called, it was Hot Springs by then. And they were going to buy this, and they were going to run off the people who lived there, and they were going to import hard-working yeomanry from the north. This is sort of the epitome of carpetbagging, if you will, if you know what that phrase means. And this is very real. I write about it in That Bright Land pretty extensively. And they hired a man named Joseph B. Lyman. You can imagine what I made out of a name like Lyman, all right, to come down from the north and to inspect the property and to write his report about whether Hot Springs was the place that they should buy up. This is real estate speculation long before you imagined it was even taking place, isn't it? This is part of the article that he wrote that was published in The Colonist, and Lyman appears in That Bright Land as well, and I have a lot of fun with him, but I'm not very nice to him. So again, Jake Ballard, the hero, calls him a carpetbagger, and with some profanity before and after, so you get the general idea. So all this was going on around Hot Springs after the war. Another interesting thing that a lot of people don't know is that there was a thriving African-American community in Hot Springs. I heard somebody in the lobby call it, it's a little tiny place. It is. But in that little tiny place, right up until probably the Great Depression, there was a thriving black community. And the part of town, there was a school in that part of town. The black people worked and did quite well on the railroad and in the hotels. So the hotel that Charles Frazier describes in 13 Moons would have employed a number of people in Hot Springs. That community is no longer there. There are graves in the Oddfellow Cemetery we know of that are of the members of that community. They did not leave, is my understanding, because of Jim Crow. So it's not the stereotypical vision of the rural South where the white people are so god-awful that black people run for their lives. It's not that kind of situation. It was economics. In other words, they left when the jobs left, when the hotels burned, and when passenger trains stopped running through Hot Springs. That's when the black community seemed to have evaporated. So a little more about that. Frazier mentions Jump Off Rock, which is Lover's Leap. Lover's Leap is still there. Lovers still go there. Thankfully, most don't leap. It appears in the beginning, I think right in the beginning of chapter 9, when Will first sees Claire and may or may not, well, at that point, he doesn't know it's Claire. It's the infamous woman in black, right? Lover's Leap is famous because, for one reason, the Drovers Road, the Buncombe Turnpike, ran right by the foot of Lover's Leap because it had to be fitted in between the river and the rock. And when you go down there now, you can walk that little section of the Buncombe Turnpike if you want to. You can't go too far. It gets pretty, and it's on the Appalachian Trail too, so you have a chance to spend a little time on the AT and on the old turnpike at the same time. That brings us now to a couple of other things that I would share. If you're really interested in Hot Springs and you want to have a book club that's totally devoted just to Hot Springs so that you can go down there and drink and soak, not necessarily in that order. By the way it's set up now, you can take your wine with you right into the hot tub. Some of you are nodding. I can tell you've done that. We'll have you testify after a while. You know, we're going to pass the plate, Wiley said. We'll have testimonials also. So this novel, it was published in 2016, is set in 1866, the summer after the end of the Civil War. The hero of this novel is a man named James Ballard, who grew up in the South, but whose mother took him north into Pennsylvania when his father died before the war, and so he fought for the Union Army, et cetera, et cetera. And what's interesting, perhaps, in this context is that this novel is set at almost exactly the same time period within, let's say, 10 years of these two chapters in 13 Moons. So again, there's a fictional overlay there, which sometimes happens. I said earlier that there are places in western North Carolina that seem to be almost haunted, and the haunting generates story and music, and story and music turns into novels. And so again, interestingly enough, you see in That Bright Land that there's something there, particularly as it had to do with recovering from the Civil War. This is a novel about healing. Last thing I'd say, sometimes when people would say, well, what's it about? And I'd go into this long-winded description, and they'd say, well, what's it really about? And I would say, you know Coal Mountain? And they'd say, yeah. I'd say, it's about what happens after that. And they'd say, oh, okay. And so again, this is just a bow to Charles Frazier, right? He helped me actually set the stage. And I think it's important too, because Hot Springs history is what generates this interest in it as a place. So more to come. So the thing I would say is that after the Warm Springs Hotel burned in 1884, and you're going to hear a pattern now, we like to burn things down in Madison County. After this hotel burned in 1884, a man named James Rumbo, who had bought the property from Patton with his wife's money, by the way. Wife's money is good for buying hotels. And when it burned, he went back and built, the railroad reached the village by then, 1882. And keep in mind, the railroad is the interstate, if that makes sense. That's how people traveled. In 13 Moons, of course, Will Campbell the railroad isn't all the way to the hotel by that point, so he has to ride to get there. And at the end of chapter 9, he takes Claire in a buckboard, I think, back to the railhead as she's leaving there and leaving him. But Rumbo invested, and he built something called the Mountain Park Hotel, which is the primary setting, and we'll get to this in a few minutes, for a short time to stay here. It was a gorgeous place. It was again, larger, fancier, happier, more elegant, probably, than the Warm Springs Hotel. During the time between the fire and the rebuilding, the property was owned briefly by the Southern Improvement Company, which was really a Northern Improvement Company. We've already talked about that. But Rumbo got the property back. They couldn't pay on their tab, and so he built this hotel. And the thing we need to know is that it was back in when they were building the hotel, they discovered several new springs. And instead of being approximately 100 degrees, they were somewhere between 105 and 110 degrees. And so the city mothers and the city fathers got together and changed the name of the town, right? Being good PR people, good Northern investors. They changed the name of the town from Warm Springs to Hot Springs. Few details. It was one of the most elegant resorts in the country. It had a 200-room hotel, a barn, a stables, a spring house, a bathhouse of 16 marble pools. It was surrounded by beautiful lawns and the first golf course in the Southeast. So my thought is, who in here likes to play golf? Come on, you can admit it. You're among friends. All right. So I think the three of you should get together and take your 9-irons and a bag of balls and go up to Hot Springs, and on that big lawn right there in front of the Hot Springs Spa, I think you should knock it around the yard a little bit. Then at the next cocktail party you attend, you can say, I just played the oldest course in the Southeast, with a straight face, okay? The golf course and the hotel, of course, were flooded in 1916, the huge regional flood in July of 1916, but that survived. And then in 1917, when it was obvious that the war was going on in Europe, there was a worldwide depression that was beginning to slowly settle over the economy. Fewer and fewer people could afford to go spend 2 or 3 or 4 months at a mountain getaway and eat healthy food and soak in the mineral tubs every day. So what the Rumbo family did was rent the hotel grounds to the federal government, and in spring of 1917, they built the famous Hot Springs German internment camp. It's not a prisoner of war camp, it was an internment camp, and the internment camp was for German civilians, non-combatants, who were in the U.S. They were primarily sailors in merchant marine ships and in large passenger liners. The biggest, grandest ship in the world in 1917 was Die Vaderland, which was, of course, in New York when war was declared. And so the crew of Die Vaderland and a number of other German ships were rounded up, and because we were afraid they were saboteurs, of course, Germans boil babies and burn churches and things like that, so of course we were worried about it, so we had to put them somewhere, and where we ended up putting them was little old Hot Springs. This novel, published in 2012, is set almost entirely in Hot Springs and in the German internment camp. There are a few scenes in Asheville, and it concludes in New York City, but I'd say 90% of those pages are set right there in Hot Springs. And that's, of course, on the cover of the novel is a picture of the Mountain Park Hotel. I'm going to show you a few pictures of the German internment camp. These photographs, the next few slides, were taken by a man named Adolf Thielbach, who was one of the German internees. He was a photographer, and he took this picture. The bunkhouses where the sailors lived, or where the Hot Springs campground is now, on the left-hand side of the road as you're driving into town. And this is a picture that Thielbach took. I think it must have been taken probably from the hotel in order to get that vantage point. This is the inside of the barracks. I'll tell you a little more about Thielbach in a minute, and why we have these photographs still. This is a little village that the German officers built on the right-hand side on the grounds of the Mountain Park Hotel while they were interned there, and they were only there, they were there less than 2 years. So using driftwood and scrounged lumber and nails they bought with money they either had or earned in town, they built a village, a Black Forest village. It had a church, which you see at the end of the street, and the roof of the church, it was roofed with tin cans from the commissary. And obviously it has a steeple. They also built a carousel down by the river. Now, on one hand, you think, really? They were that talented? But think about it. The officers were extraordinarily well educated. They were extraordinarily sophisticated. They had gone to European universities. They spoke many languages. They traveled all over the world. And they ended up in little tiny Hot Springs, which was really the reason I started the book in the first place. So this is a picture of the village. This is a photograph from the New York Times, which was published in August the 9th, 1917. It's a picture of German officers playing chess and, for those of you who like cigars, smoking cigars on the grounds of the hotel in the internment camp. Life was not that hard. Okay, in fact, there was a lot of criticism of the federal government and of the internment camp because life wasn't that hard. They thought that these Germans should suffer because, of course, by the fall of 1917, our boys were getting killed overseas. Last photograph from the Theobach collection, one of the sailors built a crocodile or an alligator out of driftwood, and here are some Germans pretending to be eaten by the alligator and beating it with a stick while it eats that one man's coat. So again, you can see they had a great sense of humor. They were enjoying, they were sitting out a really, really brutal war in a beautiful place and by and large enjoying life for what it's worth. Last thing about Theobach before we go on, these photographs ended up in a kind of a photo album. He printed them there during the war in the camp. He put it in an album. That album was lost for decades. Somebody found it in an attic in New England. And when they opened the photo album, just like your grandmother has like 20 of them, right, that are very embarrassing, they opened up the photo album. They didn't know what in the heck they were looking at until they saw one picture that had the sign for the Mountain Park Hotel in the picture, and it said Hot Springs, North Carolina. So they wrote to the Madison County Library and said, we're getting ready to toss this, would you like to have it? And in between salivating, the nice ladies at the Madison County Library right there in Marshall, you know, hastened to call them back and say, yes, we'll send you postage. So they have the original of all these photographs in the library in Marshall. And it's a miracle, quite frankly, because there are some American photographs of the village, particularly that they built inside the camp, but very few, and the few photographs that were in the New York Times. But because of Theobach and Miracle of Chance, we've got a lot of really great photographs. We can speed the story up from this point. I'm watching the clock, and I know we need time for questions. The hotel burned in 1920, when a short time, sadly, during the winter, when no one was in it, nobody lost their life. When when Short Time to Stay Here was published, I would get these wonderful emails from people who would say, we want to stay in the hotel. How do we can't find it on the internet. How do we, and you had to write them back and say, it's been gone a long time, okay. When it burned, there were two smaller brick hotels on the property after that, one built by the Rumbo family, and they, of course, burned. And so nothing there, and for a long time there was nothing there. Local people would go down and sneak into what now looks like the old abandoned bathhouse, right? And, you know, climb in a window or hammer the lock off the door so they could, you know, with their boyfriend or girlfriend, bathe in the tubs. Nothing was there until the Hicks family bought it some years back, and of course now it's the spa. One other thing I want to show you before we stop is an inn that was there in the time of the Civil War called Sunnybank. Have any of you been to Sunnybank? Oh, there you go. It's a hiker hostel primarily, right? And that may have been how you were there. It appears in several novels, and its owner during the early part of the 20th century was a woman named Jane Gentry. And Jane Gentry is important because in 1916, Cecil Sharp traveled through western North Carolina collecting the ballads from England and Scotland, and she sang for him. And she was one of the great singers, one of the predecessors of people like Sheila K. Adams and Sheila K.'s daughter and Donna K. Norton and Joe Penland and that whole generation of singers. One of their ancestors in spirit was Jane Gentry. Quickly, and just for fun, the Holy Ghost Speakeasy and Revival, a lot of the scenes from that, it's about a bootlegger / evangelist. what can I tell you? All right, it just seems like those things go together, right? And the thing I will say is that a lot of the scenes in that novel also are set in Hot Springs, including what I would like to offer. Pat Conroy always says the greatest death scene in American literature is Ben's death in Look Homeward Angel. If you haven't read it and you're feeling good about yourself, just read that and it'll depress it. Okay. Well, I'd like to say the greatest wedding night sex scene in American literature might be from this novel. I'm not going to tell you much more than that, except they tore the bed down, okay? And it happens in Sunnybank. And one of the fun things about it was Elmer Hall, who owns Sunnybank, after he read the novel, my phone rang one day, he called and said, "Terry, this is Elmer. It happened." He said, "There's this Baptist preacher who came there on his anniversary with his Bible-toting wife, and by God, they tore the bed down." So truth is stranger than fiction. That's all I know how to tell you. Here is the bathhouse, the original bathhouse from the era of the Mountain Park Hotel, early 20th century. There are scenes, of course, in 13 Moons that probably, it might not have looked like that during the Warm Springs period. It probably has been rebuilt. But if you have a Hot Springs novel, you just about have to put your characters in the hot water, right? And what happens after that, you shouldn't read if you're easily scandalized. Okay, but yeah, you know, so there has to be that. I suppose where I should stop, and we can do questions, is with this. In fact, maybe I'll go back until we get to a nice Hot Springs picture. Yeah, there we go. There's the mountain park. Hot Springs, in my mind, is one of those warm places, not just in terms of the water, but in terms of the literature that has sprung up through it and around it and about it. Famously, of course, Heinrich Schliemann, who discovered Troy, declared, the archaeologist declared there were 9 layers if you dug down there, 9 different cities, of which the Troy of the Iliad was one. It has always struck me that if an archaeologist went to that piece of land that is right there where the Spring Creek runs into the French Broad River and where Hot Springs Spa is today and began to dig, you would find not just hotel after hotel after hotel, but you would find layers upon layers upon layers of story and song and beautiful structures and history, at least 5 layers deep. And of course, the deepest layer would be native people, the kind of people that are written about in 13 Moons. So let's pause and thank you. So questions, you're supposed to come up here with a microphone and
We also have runners if you don't want to.
oh, runners.
Good evening, Terry. It's always such a pleasure to be with you.
Thank you,
Thank
Wendy.
you. I wanted to bring to mind the history of Madison County and knowing about the Allen stand and how important that has been to our community in the region of Western North Carolina. And that right there is a story within itself because she was a granddaughter of Noah Webster from Webster's Dictionary. So you can only imagine the information that we could get from Allenstown and how she also worked with Brass Town and C. Campbell, both of those places, as well as looking at Vanderbilt and how she worked with her to get the things going at the Grove Park Inn. I would love to see something like that put together.
Is that a request? Are we playing requests? I think Wiley should do that. No, No, I'm teasing. One of us should do it. There's definitely a story there in the craft tradition in the mountains in Madison that started in Madison County, and I think you're spot on.
I'll help you write it.
Okay, there you go. All right, well, I'm going to file that away. I love the idea for the simple reason that there's so much in it that has to do with the work of the hands, right?
And how they worked with the community there in Madison County. But then you've got the Nancy Morgan case.
So, all right, y'all. Do y'all know what she's talking about? The folk arts tradition that we now think of. When you take visitors to the Folk Arts Center on the Parkway, that all began, much of that began, that tradition at a place called Allen Stand in Madison County. Again, once again, we're in the center of what I think of as the center of the earth. And it began with Northern Presbyterians who came south to help mountain people. On the one hand, that sounds dreadful, but on the other hand, they were very sincere. They started Dorland Bell School in Hot Springs. All my aunts, my dad's sisters, went to Dorland Bell. And the craft tradition, the weaving tradition, the tradition of making baskets, of wood carving, all of those things didn't just begin at Allen Stand, but Allen Stand was a point on the map, if we went back to the map, that where so much of that came together, and it was there were outsiders and insiders, and a lot of the history of Western North Carolina, by the way, is about outsider, insider. It's about people who come here because it's a beautiful place, and people who were born here, perhaps generationally born here, and one of the things I come back to over and over and over again is how those two individuals or two communities come together. It's not easy, by the way. The love affair in A Short Time to Stay Here is about a documentary photographer from New York City and a mountain boy, a runaway who grew up in some of the most isolated part of Madison County. And it's not easy for them. They can't understand what either one of them says. And that's sort of a joke, but it's also not so much of a joke, right? And so, but just that creative tension between somebody who comes here from the outside and somebody who was born and bred here. Yeah. All right, Wendy, we got it. We got you. Yes, please.
How about the mineral springs out in West Asheville?
Sulphur Springs.
Sulphur Springs?
Yeah, so I don't know much about it. I know again it was one of those places that people came to for the medicinal purposes of the water, and yeah, oh yeah, no, I totally agree. I think, and again, one of the things we're saying to ourselves is there's story here everywhere you look. And if you have a kind of historical consciousness, the way I do, it's hard to walk down the street without being aware of what's happening right now, but also what happened 100 years ago. It's a curse and a blessing at the same time, trust me, right? In other words, you're always hearing those voices. I said not long ago in front of a couple of dear ballad singers from Madison County that if you're from here, it doesn't make you a better person. In fact, some cases, you could argue the opposite, I don't know. But what it does do is it gives you a sense of the layeredness of life here, both in terms of Allen Stand, Sulphur Springs, and West Asheville, that where we're standing, of course, was once Cherokee land, for example, and from that point on in history, there are depths upon depths. The way I said it that night was, if you're from here, you hear your grandmother's voice in the wind. And my ballad singing cousin said, "That's right." Just because your grandmother's here, in a way. Yeah, that gentleman.
Can you say a bit more, if you know, about the Native American sort of presence at Hot Springs? Like, was there a Cherokee village there, or was it known, or any way like that?
I honestly don't, I have read a lot of speculation, but no archaeological proof. What seems to be the case is that the two spots on the river, one was Paint Rock, and some people believe there are pictographs on Paint Rock. I don't know that I believe it, even though I've read it over and over and over again, and I've gone looking. And then also Hot Springs, and they're only about 5 miles apart. And so what seems to have been the case is that the Cherokee, which is all we know, that's as far back as we know, with no archaeological evidence, those two places were sacred places, meaning that they traveled there. I don't know that I don't think there was a village there, but they traveled there for ceremonial reasons. Right, and again, because of the hot mineral baths and also because of Paint Rock. Just upstream from Hot Springs, if you're a rafter, is a place called Frank Bell's take that back, is where the railroad trestle crosses the river just upstream. It's called the Deep Water Trestle. The Cherokee believed a water monster lived in the river there. So the Cherokee presence is imprinted on the landscape, but I've never read or seen or heard anything that leads me to believe it was a village. Other thoughts before we cease? So, thing I would offer, and again, sort of in closing, is that history plays an interesting role, right? There are lots of places on the map and a lot of places in western North Carolina where there were once thriving towns or communities that no longer exist. And so 100 years ago, there was a place called Anderson Cove or Highlands where there was a thriving community of well over 100 souls. And now it's basically empty. Hot Springs is like that in the sense that a number of times during its history, it was extraordinarily important. If you were on the street in Manhattan, New York City, I'm imagining y'all on the street, and you said, "I'm going to Springs for the summer," you meant Hot Springs, North Carolina. And now we go there, and it's where the Appalachian Trail crosses the French Broad River, and that's it. And you can soak in a hot tub. But its history is much grander and much more complex and much more, shall we say, storied.
Thank you, Terry. That was exactly what I hoped it would be. So thank you for reading my mind and delivering. I was talking with my students today about how literature, especially fiction, prose, gives us a chance to time travel. And that's what we've done tonight. And so reading 13 Moons or any of Terry's novels, especially those set in Hot Springs, gives us a chance to time travel back to a place that has been a lot of things, but has always been the same thing at its source. So thank you all so much for joining us tonight. Please join us again in person or virtually, to our friends who are joining us virtually, for our October 28th event with Charles Frazier and Annette Clapsaddle. We'll be back here. We'll have a lot more to talk about, a lot more questions, but it's a joy to see all of you. Thank you for continuing to support this program and this university, and I will see you all soon.